I'm Stan Crowe. I'm moderating this panel. I'm going to pass it this way. We'll start with introductions, and then we will go ahead and get on with it. So,
hello, I am Christopher Baxter. I am an author and a podcaster, one of the hosts of A More Civilized podcast. And more pertinent to this panel, I have been known to lecture on video games, critique video games, and I'm currently working on a video game with one of the fellow hosts of my podcast.
I've already introduced myself a couple times, but I'm also the author of 6 books and a couple of sci-fi anthologies. My books cover both clean noodle romance and murder mysteries, so how's that for crossing genre boundaries? As far as being on this panel, I love to play video games, and I write stories, and I love to evaluate the stories in the video games, and I think that if you can tell a good story in one medium, you can definitely tell it in another with a little bit of work. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it on. You got it.
So my name is Elle Palmer, and similarly, I don't make video games, but I enjoy them. I've got a couple books out, so my series is the Pippington Tales, so if you like, the world is like if you took the setting of Downton Abbey and put in the magic of Once Upon a Time, so if that sounds fun to you, we can talk. I also have a bachelor's degree in English and film, and I think, as you said, any storytelling medium, you've got to, it doesn't matter how the structure, what the medium is, because you still have to tell a good story. And I think that's part of what I bring to the table.
Okay. My name's Jay Barnson. I actually started out in the video games industry and moved into writing more recently. I started in 1994 writing launch titles for a console that the industry thought was going to fail, because how would Sony possibly compete with the likes of Sega? And so anyway, worked in the video game industry for several years, did the usual assortment of hits, flops, canceled games, movie adaptations. Worked on Twisted Metal, Warhawk, Jetmoto, the Animorphs, worked on Tale of Despero, so failed movie adaptation. And more recently I've worked on indie video games. Recent one was a computer role-playing game called Frayed Knights, The Skull of Smackdown, which is a kind of tongue-in-cheek, part parody, mostly homage to the classic dungeon-crawling RPGs. And in fact, that's kind of where I started going into writing, because I received some awards and a lot of things about the storytelling in that one. I figured, well, gee, if people like the storytelling, maybe I should learn how to write, and I figured I'd go ahead and get published, get a short story published and get that out of my system. Many short stories and now novels down the road. My latest novel's Blood Creek Witch, a contemporary fantasy, and it's just found out this week that it's a finalist for a Whitney Award. So I'm starting to learn how to do this writing thing, maybe.
Well, good, thanks. So we've already kind of touched on the first question I really wanted to go into, and that was about just storytelling in various mediums. So let's discuss the unique challenges of telling a story in a video game medium as opposed to on the screen or on the page. You're smiling, so that means you need to answer that.
I'm going to start a fight. Okay. My contention is that the requirements of good narrative storytelling are contradictory to the needs of good gameplay. Okay, well, maybe it's not that controversial. Okay, well, there's a, for an example, when you're writing a story, try-fail cycle. When you're playing a video game, you've just lost one of your main team members and your favorite sword in a combat. Are you going to go ahead and accept that failure because it's going to make a better, dramatic narrative? No, you reload the save game. If you're playing a sport, if you're professional sports, and, of course, as an observer, the most exciting stuff is if, the team you favor pulls it out. It's a close game all the way through, and they're behind, and hey, they make a great, half-court shot right at the final buzzer, and they win the game. That's exciting. If you're a player, is that how you're going to play the game? No, you're going to run up the score as much as you can. You're not going to go for the drama. You're going for the win. And that is an extremely unique challenge, I think, in making a good story for a video game. And it's not insurmountable, but it's a pain in the butt.
I think one of the unique challenges of writing video games or telling a story in a video game medium is the fact that video games, much more than many other mediums, tend to be a lot more interactive. In fact, you put the story down, ideally, unless it's missed, but no, that was interactive. So the fact of the matter is, you only have so much control over this story, and you have to leave enough room for the players to control their portion of this story. Because if they feel like they have no control, let's be honest, you're still going to have a storyline, and you still expect the players to get from point A at the beginning of the story to point B, and any number of points in between. But if they feel like they have no control over where they're going, ever, how's that going to help replayability? And so you have to find that balance between what is the story that you want to tell and how can I draw someone in enough so that it is also their story through their actions. In fact, you have to take time to pause. The easy example is, here's a story, great, now you have to fight this guy. So you pause, you have your fight sequence, and then you move on. But what happens if the fight goes badly? As he was saying, it's reload the game or you not. So that interaction is something that has to be there from the beginning, and you have to keep the players in mind.
Interactivity, of course, video games as a medium are by far the youngest genre we have in existence. They're an entirely new medium, and nothing like this has really happened in thousands of years. We had movies come along, but those are more or less, there's a lot of camera work that had to be learned, there's a lot of sound design, a lot of stuff, but it's still basically a new iteration of plays, of the theater. Whereas video games, we are still in our infancy in learning how to produce an interactive experience that can still tell a meaningful story. And there's a lot of ways people get around that hurdle, limiting the amount of times you can save games, limiting where you can save games, not giving you the option, just auto-saving the further you go. There's a lot of ways to work with that. Another of the difficulties of writing video games as opposed to others is that ideally in a video game, one of the greatest strengths of video games is you can get your audience into the head of the character more than any other medium. We'll play a game, and my favorite example is Subnautica. I've been playing recently. Subnautica is the game that taught me that I am not just made uneasy by depths of the ocean, I have a genuine phobia. That game terrified me. It took me 60 hours to get through that game because I could not make myself go into the scary places. I nearly threw my laptop off my lap at one point, and I was almost screaming. My wife was laughing her head off. And the worst part about that is I'd gotten so scared by that point that I just caved in and I looked up the invulnerability cheat codes. I was invulnerable. Nothing could hurt me in that game, but I still couldn't make myself do anything. I was so scared. And that's the advantage of video games, is you can get someone into that headspace where they're not thinking of it as a game. But the tricky part of that is you have to guide them into the right headspace with a lot of games. If you want to tell a story about a certain type of person as opposed to simply letting the player make up who they are, then you need to very gently guide them into the space where you want them to be, where they're going to start thinking like that person. Because if you just try and drop them and say, this is you now, a lot of people are going to fight against that and get frustrated. Another good example I'll give real quick of that is Spec Ops: The Line. You become a horrible person by the end of that game. Just horrible, horrible. That's the point, is delving into how horrible people can be. And it plays with the disassociation you do feel, but it's still this very gradual, it pushes you into places where you're uncomfortable being. and it does that very gracefully.
And similar to Spec Ops, the line is IRS Taxman, where it forces you to work for the federal government collecting people's money. I'm just kidding, that's not a real game. I was going to add something, but go ahead.
So in film theory, which is basically the literary theory for film, one of the things that's discussed a lot is what's called spectator theory. So how do we interact with whatever medium we're doing? So with film theory, a lot of it is, it's a very one way, that we are watching what's going on the screen, and then and the producer of that is sending in the information one way, and then we have whatever's going on in our way. In a way, with video games, it's a two-way thing, that yes, you have what's already there on the screen coming towards you, of you're getting this information, but you have to, like we've been saying, create that room for that. And to kind of reiterate what you're saying, you got to think about your point of view. I'm sitting here thinking about, like, some of my books have one point of view character and some of them have 5. And in a video game, you have your one point of view character that's you, that is a proxy for whoever is playing, and you have to think about that. And one of the things that I've been sitting here thinking about is sometimes the narrative doesn't matter in a game. So you've got to think about, how much does your narrative matter and how much does your gameplay matter? Because if you're talking about a game like an RPG, like anything in the Final Fantasy series, Mass Effect, anything like that, story is a huge part of that game. Gameplay matters, but story is a huge part of that game. And then you have a lot of games where it's like, I get to go blow things up and it's pretty awesome. And that's the point of the game, is to make things bounce off of walls or shoot things or whatever. Like, that's the point of the game, and there might be like a treacly storyline. And I think that's something you have to think about when in designing the game, is how much is the story a core part of what the game is.
Really, that has evolved over the years. I mean, you remember, for those of us older, if you may remember Pong, there is literally no story. I mean, it's just ping pong with a square. Now, if they'd put Forrest Gump in that and made it 3D, then that would be really cool. But we've had the chance to evolve, kind of like Christopher was saying, we're still in our infancy of doing this. And so sometimes you decide you don't want a story. And that's fine. If you just give some good, solid gameplay, fantastic. More power to you. You might sell who knows how many copies. I mean, take, for instance, Minecraft. There is literally no story whatsoever to Minecraft. You're thrown into a world. You just do stuff, but it is awesome. And millions of people play it, probably for a lot longer than they should. I'm not naming names, but the story is clearly not involved. And yet you can make up your own story, because, you know, for any of you who have played Minecraft, how many of you have grabbed someone and said, oh, come here, look at this thing I built. And they'll see a collection of bricks, and they'll be like, great. And you'd be like, but that took me 15 hours. I had to mine down like 35 levels just to get to the first block. And you know, you make your own story. And then on the flip side, you have the RPGs Laura was talking about. Some of the ones that I like, a good comparison between RPGs is, there's the ever popular WoW. And there's also Star Wars The Old Republic. Anyone played Star Wars The Old Republic in here? Great, we got a few nods. Mass Effect is another one. One of the things I love about Star Wars The Old Republic, and I really give kudos to the developers for this, is that they delved into several storylines, and yet they were still able to create this one overriding arc and have a lot of different ways to get there. And, you know, for any of you who have written a book, sometimes it's hard enough just to pull off the main arc and a few sub-arcs, but the fact that they can have you go in numerous different directions across multiple different character classes. I mean, just the amount of storytelling that goes into Star Wars The Old Republic is very impressive, at least, you know, from what I've seen so far. My wife has played every character class repeatedly, and so I've picked up on a lot of the storylines. But they still allow you to come back to that main arc. In fact, they actually end up making you a galactically recognizable character, which a lot of games don't. World of Warcraft, played that for a few years. They have some fantastic stories. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's kept Blizzard going strong for all these years, is they actually tell some pretty good stories. Some of the stories aren't so good anymore. They've kind of lost that a little bit. But even with the storytelling they have in WoW, you're still part of something big, but you're not necessarily a focal character, which is fine. because it's still an enjoyable game. And so that is a concern that you have to address, is how much do you want your characters to interact? How much of a part of the story do you want them to be? Which really leads to another question that we've touched on a little bit. How do we as writers make compelling interactions between the game and the players, and just for the players in general? How do we do that?
There's several different approaches. The one that I kind of like the least is the one that's the most popular right now, which is the one used in Spec Ops: The Line and stuff like that, which is, you have a little bit of interaction, you have a little bit of story, and then a little bit of interaction, a little bit of story, and the story's, with a few choices, is forcing you along a certain direction. It's a linear narrative, and you get to, it's basically like riding a roller coaster. You get to have the thrill of being on it, but it's taking you to a certain place. But you have everything, that you have a spectrum, and I think a lot of it means we need to embrace some new tools and new approaches. You mentioned Pong. I think one of the best, most interesting narrative stories, like Minecraft or something like that, is The Sims. Who's played The Sims? Okay, you get all kinds of stories in your head. I mean, you are as much the writer as anyone. I mean, they're just doing interactions in there, and they let the player create their own story, which I think is one of the tools, and it's a difficult one for us as writers, because we write, we tell story, we've got, things we want to tell, and we have to relinquish a lot of that to the game. The approach that's not being used as much currently, but I think the tools are starting to get out there, it is very challenging, is to try and let the computer interact with the player more and give some of that storytelling power, like in The Sims, to the computer, to the AI. There was anyone play Left 4 Dead? Okay, it's getting a little older now, but that was one where the AI was actually, it was building the drama. You basically had, I think they called it the director or something like that, and it would change things up on you, but it wasn't strictly random. It was trying to set up the nice dramatic situations. And of course, like any video game trope, when you start seeing a whole bunch of health and ammo, you're like, oh crap, what am I about to run into? And of course, so it's got all the stuff to build up the music, because the brute's about to come out. Anyway, those sorts of things where you can say, okay, the player is going along this far. Let's take what the player is doing and run with that, and start putting in, anything from, you have a lot of the games where you kind of have like the Mad Libs fill in the blank for the hopefully not randomly generated, but nice, good procedural generation of story, working with you as a writer. The approach I used with Frayed Nights seemed like a brilliant idea at the time, because it was text-based. I didn't use any voiceovers. I'm like, I'm going to make sure that the characters respond not just to you completing a mission, but how you completed a mission, because that's one of a powerful feature, when the characters recognize what you did, not just that you did something. It's like, oh, you used this to solve the problem as opposed to this other thing. That's very clever. And that was a huge thing, and I found myself having to write 6 or 7 different variations of the same dialogue for every dialogue in the game, and it got pretty insane keeping track of that. There are some ways around that, but I think we have a lot of tools developed. You say video games are in its infancy, and we were saying that 30 years ago, too. It's been around for 50 years. And, it's been around for longer than that, since Tennis for Two back in the 1950s. But as a commercial thing, since Pong and some of the early things, we've had a long time to noodle on it, but we, keep kind of going into the area of safety.
I think one thing I've noticed that one of the biggest draws for me in a game is just having something I want to do. If you can find something that'll grab the attention of your players and really get them interested in pushing through whatever obstacles you put in their path, because obstacles are what creates story, generally speaking. Conflict, difficulty, even if that's one of the things that creates story in games like Minecraft, where they haven't written a story, is you get in an obstacle. You know, every story you ever tell about Minecraft is, oh man, I got in this nasty situation. I found this awesome plateau to build on, and then I fell off the end of it in the middle of the night, and I was surrounded by monsters with almost no health, and my only way up onto the plateau was around the other side of it, and so I had to sprint through the darkness. This actually happened to me. I tell this all the time. And it was terrifying, and it was amazing. It was a wonderful moment. And it happened, but it all happens because they have goals that they want to achieve. And those can be more self-directed goals, like in a more open world thing like Skyrim. Whereas I looked at Skyrim and I went, okay, there's a lot of stuff to do here. What do I want to do? And the answer, of course, is I want to go rob everyone blind. And so I went and looking for the Thieves Guild first thing. And every obstacle that came in my path, it wasn't a problem. It just increased the experience, the enjoyment of the experience, because I wanted to get further along that path. I wanted to be the best thief around. And then you get more linear games that don't necessarily have a lot of variety, but if they put something in front of you that you want, that you can go for doggedly, I like, this is what pulled me through Subnautica. It's like I was terrified. If this had just been another Minecraft, which it basically was on the surface, I would have put that down the second I encountered my first Leviathan, and I would have gone and rocked in a corner for a bit and then moved on with my life. But there was a story. Oh man, I loved that story, and I wanted to know. I put myself through just horrible, horrible things because I wanted to know how that story went. So story is a big draw, and then another example I like is Shadow of the Colossus. It's linear. Everybody who goes into that game is going to go along the same basic path, but you want to see that next Colossus. You want to find that next puzzle and know how it's going to go, and that pulls you through some really interesting experiences.
Shadow of the Colossus is such an amazing game, and that was made for the PlayStation 2, and they've remade it for PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4, I believe. Because one, it's gorgeous. It is a gorgeous game. And two, what makes that one fascinating is it's a combination of a linear story path, but it's also an open world that you get to choose which Colossus you get to go fight. And each level is hard. And I think the story in that is really interesting because what those game makers were able to do is a very, very simple storyline that there's no dialogue really, or there's a little bit of dialogue. There's no names for characters. There's no names for worlds. There's no and this is how, as writers, we can get caught up in and this is how my world is built, and this is my magic system, and this is the science of the world, and here is every single detail, and this rock came from this historic thing, and get into those details. And I think that's true of any medium that you write in, that you're trying to create that nuance in things. But with Shadow of the Colossus, they don't have any of that. You just have an idea of the world. It's almost like the essence of a story, and you can fill in, and there's a million blanks that you can fill in. And that's part of why that's one of my favorite stories in a video game, is it's very sparse, but it's just enough to make that main character compelling as he's going to fight the Colossus.
I just wanted to add to that, it was a very brave thing to do because it's so vague. Everybody that picks up Shadow of the Colossus has a different version of that story in their head. I've never talked to anyone who had the exact same experience as me, even though we fought the exact same colossi and had the exact same ending. But my view of what that story was completely different than theirs because they never gave you any specifics. It was very brave.
Well, with making compelling interactions, it does go back to, as has been said multiple times, this story. Think about the interactions you've had in your own life with people. Think about the moments that you remember of just talking with someone or even just being with someone. What are the stories that come to mind as you search back through your own life and think, when did I really want to do something? And what is a really, truly good or bad memory that I have that maybe altered the course of my life? If you want compelling interactions, you need compelling characters. You need compelling motivations for your player to do something, and you need compelling goals. And those are the things that are at the core of the interactions. I think one game, I saw the anime based on it, but it was originally a computer game. It was called Canon. I don't know if anyone heard of that. It was originally, okay, we got at least one nod. It was originally basically five separate love stories, and the anime follows that fairly closely. But that, for me, was a compelling series, and I imagine I would have loved the game for the same reason, because the series, I learned to love the characters. I actually made an emotional connection with each of those five side characters that were all interacting with the main character. So if you want compelling interactions, don't have cardboard cutouts for your side characters. If it's an NPC, if it's a shopkeeper, hey, that's fine. But even a shopkeeper could be made interesting. Why is this person a shopkeeper? Maybe once upon a time they were a king in a faraway land and they lost their kingdom, and now they want to hide because they're ashamed in exile. You could spin an entire story off that. You can spin an entire game off that. So it's really up to you as storytellers to decide what is going to matter to your player and how to get them to get into that. And then when you give them a challenge, make sure that the challenge level is appropriate. I remember way back in the 1980s, I took up the first Metal Gear. And it was a fun game. No, I really did. It was way back, and I got to this one point where I just got stuck. I had no way to move the story forward at all, and I tried and I tried and I tried, and I found out actually like 6 months ago how you actually were supposed to get through that, but you know, it's too late. My Nintendo doesn't work anymore. But the point is I stopped, because as good as the story had been to that point, I as a player was completely powerless. And once I determined that I was completely powerless, it didn't matter how good the story was, I was not going to invest any more of my time playing that game. So any kind of compelling interactions I'd had leading up to that died. So you've got to make sure that there is a path forward. It can't be too easy all the time where people are just like, well, whatever. But it can't be so hard that they're just going to throw their controller down and storm out of the room and never come back.
Going back to what you're mentioning with characters, and that is something, of course, writers, that's, we make imaginary people to play with. What are who's played the Persona series? Okay, just a couple of people. Going into the game design, one of the brilliant things where they had made sure that the game design matched matched the narrative, or worked well with the narrative in that one. If you haven't played those, I recommend the 3, 4, and 5. The thing that they did that was very compelling there was that your character's progress, or how they navigated, which was what was basically a linear story, was dependent upon your social interactions with other characters. And it was brilliant, and you couldn't do them all. You couldn't be friends with all of them. You couldn't, necessarily be romantically involved with all the girls. That could be, or that could go badly. Yeah, probably. But it was all about your social connections, and those gave you the powers when you brought out, summoned the creatures and everything. Those social constructs gave you new powers in whatever the world was that you would go. They had Persona 3 was the first one I played, where suddenly at midnight most of the world froze except for a few of these people, and that's when the demons came out. Anyway, it was just really bizarre, great stuff. But what you do is during the day, it was kind of like a dating sim or a social sim, where you're going through and you're talking to people and building these relationships and getting involved in these other character stories. And that was just I thought a brilliant way to kind of bring those pieces together, and so that you had a lot of an open world and gaming the system, while also having these really meaningful and interesting interactions, and lots of little sub stories that you couldn't necessarily get through all of them in one playthrough.
Okay. So something else that I'd like to bring up for the panel is, how do you balance story immersion with clear gameplay instruction? Story immersion versus clear gameplay instruction. I'm going to actually lead off with this one. I think one bad example might be Mass Effect, where it's been compared to being thrown into a pool. That's probably just all immersion, not so much instruction. But I think whereas we're seeing more open-ended, I think as we're starting to see a lot more open-ended games with the uptick of RPGs and interaction and stuff. Okay, that was just how we woke you up. Well, I'll keep using the mic so we have sound quality for the recording. As we've seen a lot more open-ended games now, I think we've opened up a lot of possibilities for immersion. A very, very common tool is to introduce the character as kind of a newbie, a trainee, something of that sort, and then it makes a natural place to say, okay, let's do this. Like I recently took up the online game BattleTech, and you are a not super new mech warrior, and so they're not treating you like a complete greenie, but your mech has just come out of the shop, and your mentor is like, well, you know, we're about to go on this escort duty. Let's make sure your mech works. So, okay, let's make sure you can do this. Okay, great, that works. Let's make sure you can do that. Okay, great, that works. And that way you can still have the feeling of being somewhat seasoned, and like you're still in the game, but it's got a plausible rack to hang those test ideas on, and it'll show you, okay, now click this, click that. And sometimes you can kind of break the fourth wall in a test, in kind of a tutorial, but there are still ways to get into that without breaking the fourth wall.
I saw an interesting experiment with indie games, and you know, I'm a big indie game fan, but some of the simpler games that they've had to get around that, you know, they have the narrative, and it's always tough breaking the wall saying, press this button. But I have seen ones where it says, okay, press the jump button to jump onto here, and they have you do that. And the trick was, and I don't know how you do this with a more complicated game, but whatever button you pressed became the jump button. That was how you configured your controls. It basically said, you do what you think you need to do with the controls, and it works. You know, I work with virtual reality both as a game developer and as my day job, and so a lot of that is trying to get these virtual reality controls to try and move things as naturally as possible. And what makes for a natural movement there when you have, you know, very limited inputs, yet the world seems completely immersive. And I think there's some exciting things we can do there to try and make it so we don't have to have such a jump between here's the narrative immersive world and here's the gamey pieces that you need to know.
One of the things I keep thinking about is and this kind of goes back to what you were saying, you have to think about what is your main character's progression, and where do they start from. So that's going to play into both your narrative and into your gameplay, because how many skills they have when they walk in the door. So like when you play Assassin's Creed, your character already knows like 90% of the parkour that they're going to be doing for 90% of the game. But there are skills that they're going to continue to learn. So how much does your character know when they start? And that's going to help you both develop their character, but also develop the gameplay. And then from there, what is their progression? Because any narrative, even if it's Forrest Gump playing ping pong in 3D Pong, there has to be some sense of progression, both for you as a gamer and for the character. So how do you build those together to build up to the story? If your character is like already the biggest tough guy, awesome dude of all time, where do they grow? How do they change?
Actually, I should probably riff off that and mention a game that I should have said earlier when I was talking. Halo. The opening scene with Master Chief when you're configuring everything, that is fantastic because it totally makes sense. You're just coming out of cryo freeze, and the guy's like, okay, we need to make sure that you're working. It's kind of similar to the BattleTech one I mentioned, but it actually lets you calibrate your own control parameters. and yet it doesn't feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going through another tutorial. It's like, okay, look left, look right, okay, great. And it's nice because as you're in the middle of that, then all of a sudden, boom, they throw the story on top of you. And then you're like, so now all this stuff I just barely learned, you don't have to wait 10 minutes to use it. It's like, boom, use it now, go shoot something.
Portal 2 does that very well, too. So, and with a good amount of comedy right at the beginning. It's like, okay, nod your head. Now say apple, and of course you can't say anything. He's like, well, okay, good enough, brain damage, whatever. Let's go.
And that is why the cake is a lie. Christopher, anything you want to add?
I'm trying to think. I think the most common one is what you said, Stan. It's the making your character a novice in some way so that they can plausibly instruct you. That's a classic storytelling tool in any medium. It's especially in mediums with a really high learning curve like video games or like fantasy and sci-fi novels. There's a reason that Vinton from Mistborn is a novice who doesn't know anything about being Mistborn, is so that Kelsier can give her instruction and we can all learn with her. And that happens left and right in fantasy and sci-fi all over the place. Harry Potter, the vast majority of sci-fi and fantasy protagonists are novices, and that serves the dual purpose of giving them areas to grow and learn and progress. Luke Skywalker, it's everywhere. I'm trying to think of some good examples of people doing that in video games without just making your character a novice, most video games, if they're not making your character explicitly a novice who is receiving instruction, you are a relatively average person who is stepping into a new place that they don't understand, something along the lines of Limbo or Journey, who you're not necessarily a normal person, but you're just someone in a place, So that is probably the most classic way of overcoming that.
Okay, we got a question over there from the side. So for those of you who did not hear, he was talking about King of Avalor, was it? Kingdom of Avalor and Extra Credit and Dark Souls as very good examples of immersion without gameplay. So I was going to open it up for questions, just because the question asked was, how do you keep a game story feeling from shelf?
Well, I think what he mentioned there, if you haven't watched Extra Credits, by the way, that is an excellent series that is going to give you all sorts of wonderful instruction in the world of video games. But it is very much that mechanics need to be inextricably connected to story. And an example that they gave in one of their episodes was Kratos in God of War. Every speck of his design, every way he moves, every single attack he has, it all tells you about who Kratos is, that he is just this angry, vengeful bundle of violence. And it's all very instructive. Every element of the game teaches story. And a lot of the more shallow video games that you pick up where you go, man, I'm just not feeling immersed here, are ones that fail to do that separate their story and their mechanics rather than having their mechanics teach story. And often the best way to do that, ironically, is by putting your story second. If you focus on the programming first and then figure out how to tell a good story that utilizes all of that, you're going to be in a better place, generally speaking, than if you write a story that you love and try and program mechanics that will fit it.
Another one that I was just reminded of, again, playing with the mechanics and having your story go. There's the interactive novels or some of the things that they have now, which are much more story and you just kind of follow along. But has anyone here played? I'm trying to remember Doki Doki Literature Club? Okay. Not only that one twists the medium and does some great stuff with it, and it's using those mechanics against you, the player, to really tell a very creepy story. But yeah, a lot of it is if you're doing a video game, it has to be a game first. I think you hit the nail on the head. If you fail as a video game, your story doesn't matter. But I think the big thing is not. I think a lot of the times where it does feel short and shallow is when, in some cases you've got someone who really should be writing a book, and instead they're trying to force it into a game, and that the player can feel that they're on rails, and it really ends up being a really short nothing game and very unsatisfying.
for sake of time, we'll take the one question from the young man in the fourth row, and then we'll have a couple minutes for each of us to talk about what other panels we're on, what else we're going to be doing. So yes, your question. Okay, so the comment was bringing up the fact that Link actually in Run the Wild was a powerful character. Link also has like 30 years of backstory to him, so it was pretty easy to start him out as a powerful character. So yes, there are some very good examples. So love to have more questions, but I'm going to pass the mic down. We'll give a couple minutes to the authors, and then we'll go ahead and adjourn.
I was just going to add there, though, but that does serve as a method of resetting him. He basically has to pick up and start over again, and so you still have that same novice learning curve that you would in a lot of other games.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. We appreciate it and hope you have a good day.